Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Courtney Forehand, and today we are going to have a webinar on the 2022 Census of Governments. This webinar is being recorded and the presentation materials will be posted to our website under www.cml.org under training materials. For those of you who are not familiar with the GoToWebinar platform, you should see a control panel to the top right of your screen. There's an orange arrow to the left of the panel, and that will minimize the entire box. All participants have been muted for the webinar, but we encourage you to ask questions by typing them into the question box on the control panel. There will be a Q&A near the end as time permits, so please feel free to type questions as you think of them throughout the presentation into that panel. At this time, I would like to hand things over to Ramika to get us started.
Good afternoon, good morning. We're on the East Coast, so I'm always confused whether to say good afternoon or good morning. Hello, we'll start with that. So my name is Ramika. Welcome and thank you for attending this webinar on the Census of Governments. Census of Governments is the only comprehensive uniform source of statistics for economic activity for state and local governments. I am the Assistant Division Chief for Public Sector Programs, and my co-presenter today is Randy Moore. He is the Branch Chief of the State and Local Finance Statistics. So this webinar, we will provide you an overview of the Census of Governments, its components, as well as help you understand the importance of the Census of Governments, uses of the data that we publish, and help you learn about the available free resources and data tools that we have. So let's get started. As I stated before, and I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with the Census of Governments, we also refer to it as COG as an abbreviation. It's a little shorter than saying Census of Governments. As I previously stated, the COG is the only comprehensive source of uniform statistics for economic activity of state and local governments. These data follow governments over time, whether it be a fiscal year or a specific time period. These data are basically give you information about the public sector component, which is very similar to the econ census, which I hope some of you guys are familiar with. And that focus for the econ census is business. So we are more or less the counterpart on the public side or the public sector of the state of the economy. The unique thing about the Census of Governments is that the same content that's provided for the census years is actually available annually, but for a sample of the governments versus the larger census of governments. So this actually allows you to view the data and have access to the same data that the Census of Governments presents on an annual basis as well. So the key components of the Census of Governments are organization, which provide the number and the counts of state and local government units. We also have an employment component, which provides the number of state and local government employees, their payroll, and by government function. And I'll kind of go into that a little bit more later when I kind of give you a better explanation of the employment component. And last but not least, the finance, which is our largest component, which provides information on state and local government revenues, expenditures, debt, cash and securities, as well as data on public pensions. And as I stated, this is the largest chunk of the data that we have for state and local governments. So a little bit more information about the organization component. The organization component was actually mailed out in February 21. That actually gives us, like I said, the county government. So it's able to know who to mail out to for the employment and finance components, we have to know who the active governments are in the United States. So hence, that information was mailed out in February, and the survey itself is called the Government Unit Survey. So the Government Unit Survey also provides continuous updates of these governments for our government's master address file, which we refer to as the GMAF. So how are these data collected? So one way these data are collected about the number and counts of governments is through the Government Unit Survey, which is mailed out every 5 years. The 4 years that we don't do that survey, we have staff that conduct legal and directory research to determine births and deaths of governments. So we always are continually researching whether a government has come in or if a government has died. And we get a lot of those throughout the year. We also get some of that information from our respondents. So if a respondent fills out a survey and they realize that, hey, you're asking us questions and we no longer a government, they send us back the information. So that's another way. So we welcome that information because it's a way that we keep up to date with all of the births and deaths that occur within the governments. So as we're looking at what data do we have, and looking at the Government Youth Survey and the information we got from the Census of Governments in 2017, excuse me for that, the counts were relatively consistent between 2012 and 2017. I'm going to show you another slide that kind of shows a lot of fluctuation. We are, I think, at a point now where we don't have a lot of births and deaths of governments. So as of 2017, there were about 90,000 state and local governments. And if you can see here, this chart kind of breaks out for you all of the types of governments. So we also have something called the 2017 Individual State Descriptions publication. This publication provides a summary of all of these 90,000 governments and how they are organized. The summaries provide information about 5 basic types of local governments, which are county, municipalities, townships, special districts, and school government districts. And the descriptions also explain the structures of the different types of local governments and how these local government, the responsibilities of these local governments and the authorities that they have. And these will vary state to state. Maryland will not be the same as Colorado, but it's because of how those local governments are set up and the responsibilities that have been put forth on them. So like I was saying, when we look at the 2012 and 2017 census, the difference was not the same, was very small. But as we're looking at the composition of local governments now, you can see back in 1957, a large chunk of the governments were comprised of independent school districts. And now in 2017, a large chunk of the governments are more like special districts. So these are independent governments that are created for a specific purpose. So every year we have new special districts that are created and we have new and existing ones that dissolve. So an example of a special district could be water and sewage, ditch district, fire protection. It just depends on the state. So we don't notice a lot of fluctuation in the picture of local governments now because they seem to align with more special, we have a larger component of special districts than back in 1957. The next component that I'm going to talk about is employment. So the employment component provides state and local full and part-time employment, full-time equivalent, as well as payroll statistics by government function. So when we say government function, the data that we provide by function, our example would be financial administration, fire protection, police protection, natural resources, parks and rec, which you'll see in my next slide. It's very interesting, as well as education. So those are a few of the government functions for which we provide data for. These data are based on the reference period of March 12th. So for the Census of Governments, when this information is needed and when we mail out the request for information, we're asking for the reference period of March 12th. So whatever pay period covers that reference period of March 12th. Data collection for the employment component is done through various methods. For state and local governments. So for the state governments, we have a central collection. So we typically get administrative records from about 47 states. And then we have direct collection via our internet reporting tool for the remaining states. And that's just for state governments. For local governments, we get administrative records from large local governments. And then we get information from other local governments via our Centurion, our internet reporting tool, which is called Centurion. As far as school district data, a lot of that is provided centrally for the states of Florida, North Carolina, North Dakota, and Washington. All other school district data is obtained through our internet reporting tool. If you are aware of administrative record that's available that we could use, definitely let us know. And that will help because then we don't have to send the forms out or the forms out to collect the information from using our internet reporting tool. So what about the data? What did the data tell us for 2017? Please excuse the slide. They're getting away from me.
Hey, I'm sorry, I'm going to jump in here. Which slide would you like to be on right now?
The slide number 10.
Slide 10. All right. Here we go.
Here we go. The good information. Thank you. So I like to show this because it's hard to tell what is employment telling you about Colorado. So we just released our most recent data for 2020. And when you're looking at Colorado employment for state and local governments, as you can see, the top two bars are education. Most of the state and local employment fall within education, almost 60%, as you can see. And then after that, we have parks and rec, we have hospitals and police protection. These actually, it's interesting because when we're talking about what type of government employment we have within each state, a lot of the other states have fire protection and police protection at the top. But Colorado, a lot of their state and local government employees fall within parks and rec. And that's because Colorado has a lot of parks. So it's very interesting how you compare to the overall national, when you look at this as over the 50 states. So I always think that's very interesting. But you are in line with employment education being the top employer for state and local governments, because all of the states, their education covers at a minimum of about 50%. So I'm going to turn this over to Randy, and he can give you a little bit more information on the finance component of the Census of Governments.
Okay. Hi, I'm Randy Moore. I'm the branch chief of the local government finance statistics branch. My staff are the ones who work on the financial aspects of the municipal governments that you represent. We have two other branches that work on the finance component. There's a state finance branch, and we also have a public pension statistics branch, and we're all part of the financial component. If you go back a couple slides, I'm going to be on that one for the first finance one for a little while. My branch is one more back, slide 11, I think. My branch is primarily concerned with four categories of financial data. That is revenue, expenditure, debt, and cash assets. Revenues we collect by source, such as property taxes, sales taxes, intergovernmental transfers, utilities, fees, etc. Expenditures we collect by function and object. Function indicates what type of activity the spending is used for, like police protection or hospitals or highways would be examples. And then object describes the type of spending. Is the police protection spending for current operations like salaries, or is it construction or some other kind of capital outlay? Indebtedness we split between long-term and short-term debt. We define short-term debt as being due within a year. And then lastly, we collect cash and security holdings, and we split those up by the purpose that they are dedicated to, if there is one. In a census year, we produce tabulations by type of government, which means we produce separate estimates for county governments and municipal governments, township governments, when they exist in a state, and special districts and school districts. My staff also conduct an annual survey, like Ramika mentioned, in non-census years, which produces similar estimates, but only for local governments as a whole, instead of by a separate type of government. So we use a lot of administrative records in our program when they're available. For all state governments, the state finance branch gets an electronic file from the government that contains all the financial information that they need. For many large city and county governments that have a complexity that's similar to a state government, we get similar files like that in my branch as well, either often provided by the city government or the county government, or the state controller might have that information. In order to produce accurate estimates to meet our publication standards, we require at least a 50% unit response rate and a 70% dollar volume response rate. So we typically have trouble meeting the unit response rate utilizing just survey responses. So we get ourselves to that 50% level by pulling the information that we need from annual financial reports. It takes a lot of resources to do it, so we try to avoid it when we can, but that's in order to meet our response rate, sometimes that becomes necessary. 10 years ago, when we had a lot more resources, we would try to compile as many governments as possible, but now we only have enough staff to do the bare minimum required to meet our standards. When choosing which governments to compile, we always go for the largest ones because those have the biggest impact on our estimates, and we're striving to have the most accurate estimates possible. For the units that don't get compiled, we impute data for them, which basically means that we make it up assuming that they had trends that matched similar governments in their state, which can be a big assumption, but it's a necessary one nonetheless. This means that significant changes in smaller governments will get missed if they consistently don't report to us. We collect data from Colorado governments exclusively through our internet reporting tool. That bullet about limited paper questionnaires doesn't really apply to Colorado. Some state governments assist us in collecting the information that we need. Many states that already collect the information we need for their own purposes, and then they share it with us so that we don't have to ask their individual governments for the same information a second time. I do know that the Colorado state government hosts a lot of your financial reports and makes them available for downloading, but to the best of my knowledge, they don't actually store the data itself anywhere. They just put the financial reports available online. So if that's not the case and they actually do store your data somewhere in a database, please let me know, because if the state can provide us the information that we need, then we don't have to bother you anymore. On the next slide, we have a chart showing state tax data. The state tax survey, back up to, there we go, right here. So one of our finance programs is the state tax survey, which is where the data from this graph comes from. This chart's comparing the state government of Colorado's tax revenue sources to the combined state government totals for the entire United States. So by looking at this chart, you can see the state of Colorado relies more on income tax compared to the average state government, and less than the average state government on all other forms of taxes. It looks like the state government doesn't collect property taxes, and at least the portion of the total taxes that they collect for license taxes and sales taxes smaller as a percentage than the average state in the United States. And this is just for the state government. This doesn't take into account the tax revenue of the local governments. So on the next slide, we have a chart comparing the sources of revenue between the state government of Colorado and the local governments of Colorado, with an additional breakout of the taxes. As is pretty typical for local governments in the US, the bulk of tax revenue for Colorado local governments is property taxes. And while the state government tax revenues are more from income and sales taxes. And as the previous slide showed, for a typical state government, the percentage of sales and income taxes that you see here for the Colorado state government would be switched, but still it's the same two things that account for the bulk of it. Intergovernmental revenue for the state governments is typically coming from the federal government, and for the local governments, that can either be from the state government or directly from the federal government. Utility fees are the other most significant source of revenue for the local governments in Colorado, it looks like. Then the other things were small enough that they just kind of got grouped into the other category there. On the next slide, we have a similar breakout, but it's for expenditure instead of revenue. You can see that the biggest source of spending for Colorado local governments is education, which is pretty typical for local governments. I doubt that's coming as a surprise. And you can, Ramika's employment chart showed a similar trend. For state governments, it's social services like public welfare that's the biggest source of spending. And again, that's also pretty standard compared to most states in the US. Utilities and public safety are other major sources of spending for local governments in Colorado, while education and intergovernmental expenditure, most of which is sending money to the local governments, are number 2 and 3 for the state. Speaking of intergovernmental expenditure and sending money to the local governments, on the next slide, I know one of your big questions for us must be, why is responding to these surveys important to us? It's important to the federal government because that data is used by the Bureau of Economic Analysis and the Federal Reserve to produce official estimates of the survey. It's important to researchers who use these data to measure the changing characteristics of the government sector of the economy and to conduct public policy research. And similarly, state and local governments use our data for comparative analysis and developing programs and budgets, but more importantly, our data can impact the pocketbooks of local governments and state governments. The chart you're looking at here is an example of how our data can impact fund allocation a little bit. Every year, the Bureau of Justice Statistics creates a criminal justice expenditure and employment estimates for each state. To create these estimates, they look at how much the state and local governments of each state spend on police protection, corrections, and judicial and legal services. And they take those totals and create a ratio of state to local government spending on criminal justice. And that ratio of state to local is the maximum percentage of the annual Byrne Memorial Justice Assistance Grant funding that the state is allowed to keep for itself. So a set amount is designated for each state, and the state government gets to keep a certain percentage based on this ratio, and then the rest of it they're required to pass to the local governments of that state. This chart here is showing the CJEE expenditure totals for Colorado for the last 7 years. You can see that the gap has widened pretty significantly compared to 2012. So the percentage of grant money that the state of Colorado has been required to pass on to its local governments has been increasing, which is good for the local governments. So this leads me to why making sure we get as complete data as possible for the local governments is important. As I mentioned before, if we don't get reported data, we impute for the missing governments. Whenever we impute or make up the data for a local government, because we didn't get a survey response, there's a chance that we missed things like a new correction facility that was built or higher police salaries or something like that. The state government, on the other hand, always provides us with complete data, so we never miss those types of things for them. To exacerbate the issue, in non-census years, we only mail a small sample of our governments, and the small local governments are weighted to represent as many as 200 similar governments in the state. Imputing for the unit that was selected to represent 150 small special districts means that we impute for all 150 of those small special districts, as far as our estimates are concerned. So every abnormal increase in spending that we miss means less criminal justice grant money that has to be sent to the local governments. And that's just one very specific example of how our data impacts funding. And so that's it for the finance slides. I'll pass it back to Ramika to finish up the presentation.
Okay, so as we're looking at these data, I always want to give everyone the opportunity to see the additional resources that we have or materials that can be referenced. This actually is a snapshot tool that we have that actually is available on our website, and you can look at it by state and you can look at it comparatively to the United States. So this tool, it's a Tableau tool. So it breaks out every component of the Census of Governments and puts it in a graphical format so you can kind of see it, and you can pull it up for employment and finance. And when we look at finance, we're looking at debt, expenditures, pensions, things of that sort. So all of those components of the finance are available for you to view by your state. And if you want to look at how your neighboring state is doing, you can pull that up as well. There's also, we have a Census of Government website where you can access all of the data, and it is in a usable Excel format if you want to download it, manipulate it, however you want to use it to get some information that may be beneficial when you're trying to make fiscal decisions. So the goals for 2022, when we're looking at the Census of Governments, is to, number one, reduce burden for state and local governments. So if there are administrative records that you have, or if there's an opportunity for data sharing of admin data, we definitely want to know about that so that we don't have to send, like Randy said, if the state can provide it to us through their methods, we won't have to send the forms to local governments, but we're still going to have your data because the state is providing it to us. So that's one of our goals as we go into 2022 Census of Governments. We also want to streamline the content. Some of the content that we have doesn't quite accurately reflect how the economy is doing and the changes that the economy has made over the years. So we're in the process of looking at our current content so that we can make sure that it reflects the changing economy and possibly explore new areas that we should be providing data for, so we can provide the most relevant and accurate picture of the financial conditions of state and local governments. We also want to improve some of our productivity by leveraging some of our systems to increase productivity and reduce costs to respondents. And the last goal is to improve data collection process. So we can have a more dynamic instrument. So for example, if there is an area, if there's a local government that doesn't have a ditch district or water sewage, whatever the case is, we don't want to send you questions that are not relevant to the type of special district you have. So we're trying to create a more dynamic instrument so that to enhance our collection strategy, and only are asking you the questions that are relevant to your government. So when we're looking at the schedule, and I mentioned it before, we mailed out the organization component in February of 2021. We'll publish that data in December of 2023. The next component that will go out will be the employment component, and that will go out in March of 22. And then the finance components will flow out starting in October. So you get the finance, then you get pensions, and you'll get school system finance. So that is kind of the flow for the Census of Governments data collection for the 2022 Census of Governments. So in summary, when I'm thinking about what's important to you and why is this important, the public sector data help you better understand your state and local governments as well as your neighboring, if you're interested in what they're doing, their information as well. And it's important because it ensures that we provide the highest quality of data that you will need or help your state make financially good fiscal decisions. And to piggyback on what Randy said, it's important that we get these data because these are kind of the data that are used to make these types of decisions when you talk about the flow of funds, things that flow from the state to local government. So it's important that we have a full scope of high quality data so that we can make important and the correct fiscal decisions. So that's all Randy and I have. Our information is available on this slide. If you have any questions regarding any component of the Census of Governments, definitely reach out to us. But the first thing I also want to remind people is Census of Governments is coming your way. Expect our first employment component to be reaching you sometime in late March, and then the other components will come after. So please look out for that and ask us any questions if there's anything that comes up in relationship to the Census of Governments.
All right, thank you so much. Just a reminder to our attendees, if you do have a question, please type it into the question box. We do not have any questions at this moment. So if either of you would like to make a closing remark or something that you did not add to your PowerPoint that you would like to let everyone know about. And if there are no remarks and I don't see any questions coming in, then I will say that that is going to be the end of our webinar. Thank you everyone for attending today. We do appreciate your time. As we mentioned before, the PowerPoint will be posted to our website by the end of the day along with a recording of this video. So thank you for attending and we hope you all have a great day.
Thank you for having us, Courtney.
Thank you very much.